My best friend of 15 years used everything I told him in confidence to destroy my life. He forgot that I had been keeping records since the beginning. There is a specific kind of trust that only exists between people who have built something together from nothing. Not the trust of friendship, which is warm and real but ultimately untested by consequence. Not the trust of family, which is given before it is earned and carries the complicated weight of obligation. I mean the trust that forms when two people have sat across from each other in a bad month, a month when the invoices are overdue and the client is unhappy, and the thing you believed in at the beginning is starting to feel like a mistake, and both of them chose to stay. That trust is different. It is made of specific material. It has been stress tested. When it holds, you believe it will always hold, because you have already seen what it looked like under pressure, and it held then too. I believed that about Owen Mercer for 15 years. I was wrong. But I want to be precise about the way I was wrong, because I think precision matters here. I was not wrong that the trust had been real. I was wrong that what I understood as trust was the same thing Owen understood as trust. We had been using the same word for 15 years to describe two different arrangements, and the difference only became visible when he decided that the arrangement no longer served him. My name is James Callahan. I am 42 years old, and I am an architect, and I grew up in East Vancouver, in a house that my father was perpetually, lovingly, and somewhat chaotically renovating. He was an electrician by trade and a builder by disposition, and our house on Nanaimo Street was the ongoing project of a man who believed that a house was never finished, only paused between improvements. There was always a wall somewhere in a state of becoming. Studs exposed, wiring half-threaded, the smell of cut wood and joint compound that I now associate with the specific happiness of a childhood that was modest in most ways and rich in the ways that stay with you. I learned to read a space from my father, not from architecture school, though school gave me the language for what I already knew. I learned it from watching him stand in the middle of an unfinished room and understand, without measuring, without drawing anything, what the room wanted to be. He had a quality of spatial intelligence that was entirely intuitive and entirely reliable, and he used it in the service of other people's homes for 35 years without ever fully understanding that it was unusual. He thought everyone saw rooms that way. They don't. I went to UBC for architecture. It was 2001, and I was 20 years old, and I had grown up in a house full of tools, and I had never once considered doing anything other than what I was doing. Architecture felt less like a choice than a direction, the place the compass pointed when I stopped trying to point it myself. I met Owen Mercer in the second week of first year. He was from West Vancouver, the other Vancouver, the one across the bridge, the one where the houses were already finished and had been finished for some time and were not the subject of ongoing renovation projects. He was the kind of person who entered a room and immediately reorganized its social geometry around himself. Not aggressively, but naturally, the way a warm thing draws people toward it without effort. He was funny in the quick, responsive way that requires genuine intelligence. He had the gift, and I recognized it as a gift even at 20, even before I understood how rare it was, of making whoever he was talking to feel like the most interesting conversation he had had all day. We were different in the way that makes two people either incompatible or perfectly matched. I was quiet where he was loud. I was happiest when working where he was happiest when talking. I saw buildings. He saw the people who would inhabit them and the stories those people would tell about the spaces. At 20, in a school full of people who were trying to figure out how to become architects, we were the only two who had already, in some essential way, figured out what we were. We were also broke, ambitious, and constitutionally unable to work for other people's firms for very long without wanting to do things differently. In 2009, 6 years out of school, in the middle of a recession that was making the architectural landscape bleak enough that starting something felt approximately as risky as staying somewhere, we started Callahan Mercer Studio. It was Owen's idea to give it both names. I had suggested something neutral, a studio name that wasn't either of us, the kind of clean, geometric name that architectural firms often chose to signal a certain seriousness. Owen had shaken his head. "If we put our names on it, we're accountable to it," he said. "It's a promise. People know it's ours." I had agreed, because that argument made sense to me, and because Owen was very good at arguments that made sense, which is a quality I have since learned to examine more carefully. We signed the partnership agreement on a Thursday morning in November, at a coffee shop on Main Street, with Tom Callahan present because Tom was my brother, and he was already a lawyer, and he had offered to review the documents, and I had let him. The agreement was straightforward, 50-50. Equal ownership, equal decision-making authority, equal share of profit and liability. Tom had read it carefully and said it was clean, and we had signed it, and Owen had ordered us champagne that we couldn't really afford, and we had drunk it in a coffee shop on a Thursday morning and felt, with the particular clarity of people who have committed to something they believe in, that we were exactly where we were supposed to be. What followed was 15 years of building something. Not quickly. Nothing real is built quickly. The first 3 years were the years of proving we existed. Small projects, residential renovations, a few commercial interiors that we over-delivered on because over-delivery was the only marketing we could afford. Owen sold brilliantly. He walked into rooms and made clients feel that they had made the obvious choice by choosing us, that the work we would do for them was not merely competent, but was exactly what their space had been waiting for. I designed in ways that kept that promise, that delivered the thing Owen had sold, and then a little more, because a little more was what turned a client into someone who told other people. Slowly, then faster, then in the way that compound interest works. We became the kind of firm that people called without needing to be sold to. By the time we had been operating for a decade, we had 28 people, an office in Yaletown, and a portfolio that I was genuinely proud of. Not in the way of pride that needs external confirmation, but in the quieter way of someone who looks at what they have made and knows it is good. We had built houses that families were living in with the specific joy of people whose space fits them. We had built commercial spaces that worked, that were not just aesthetically considered but functionally right, places where the architecture served the life happening inside it rather than competing with it. I had built all of that alongside Owen Mercer. I had trusted him with the kind of trust I described at the beginning, the tested kind, the specific kind, the kind made of 15 years of choosing to stay in the difficult months. And then I read an email that was not meant for me, and I understood, with a clarity that arrived not as a shock, but as the slow, cold recognition of something that had been there for a long time, waiting to be seen. That the trust I had believed was mutual had, at some point that I could not precisely identify, become entirely mine. I want to be fair here. 15 years is a long time, and the Owen Mercer I am about to describe is not a simple villain, not the kind of person who was bad from the beginning and concealed it. I don't think that is what happened. I think what happened is more ordinary and in some ways more instructive. A person who was genuinely good at certain things became, over time, more interested in the appearance of those things than in the things themselves. And that shift happened gradually enough that neither of us noticed it clearly until the distance was too great to close. Owen was brilliant at selling. I want to say this without qualification, because he deserves it, and because the truth requires it. He understood clients in a way that I genuinely did not. Understood what they were afraid of, what they were proud of, what the space they were asking us to design meant to them emotionally rather than practically. He could take a brief meeting with a new client and come back with an account of their real needs that was more accurate than the needs they had described themselves. That is a genuine gift, and it had been essential to everything we built. But somewhere along the way, I think it started around year 7 or 8, when we were established enough to be taken seriously, and when Owen began getting invited to speak at industry events, to sit on panels, to be profiled in the kind of architectural and design publications that treat certain practitioners as figures rather than as people. Somewhere in there, the gift began to require something it hadn't required before. It began to require an audience. This is not unusual. Most gifts have this quality when they become sufficiently developed. They start to feel incomplete without the confirmation that they have been observed. A musician needs listeners. A writer needs readers. Owen needed rooms that recognized him. And for a long time, Callahan Mercer's studio provided exactly that. A context in which he was always, by definition, one of the people who had made the thing the room was appreciating. What changed was the referencing. I began to notice it in the way you notice things that don't quite fit. A small dissonance, easy to explain away, easier to ignore. At an industry dinner, a person I hadn't met would come up to me and say, "Owen's told me so much about your work." Not our work, which would have been natural, but your work, said in the tone of someone describing a subordinate's output. I would chalk it up to conversational shorthand. At a client presentation, Owen would refer to a design decision I had made, a structural choice, a materiality decision, something that had been entirely mine in its origination, in the first-person plural, in a way that was accurate, but that, said often enough, created a cumulative impression that the plural included him more centrally than it did. I would chalk it up to the way partners talk about shared work. There was a dinner party 4 years ago at a colleague's house in Kitsilano. Sarah and I arrived late. Owen was already there, deep in conversation with two people I recognized as potential clients, a couple who had been talking about a significant residential project in West Van. I stood near the kitchen and I listened, the way you listen to background music before you decide whether to pay attention to it. And I heard Owen describing the Waverly House, a project that had been, in my understanding of our history, the turning point. The project that had established our reputation for a particular kind of structural audacity, that had been written about in 3 publications and had resulted in 6 subsequent commissions. He was describing the Waverly House as though he had conceived it. Not lying exactly, not fabricating. The words he used were defensible individually, but the shape of the account, the architecture of the story, positioned him as the visionary and me as the capable person who had translated his vision into technical reality. The couple was leaning toward him with the rapt attention of people being told something compelling, and Owen was telling it with the fluency of someone who has told a version of this story enough times that it has stopped feeling like a version and started feeling like the truth. I stood in the kitchen doorway and I thought about the Waverly House. I thought about the night I had sat alone in the studio at 11 o'clock with trace paper and a problem I couldn't solve. A client who wanted structural openness and a site that punished it. A tension between what the architecture wanted to be and what the ground would allow. And I had found the solution alone, in the particular quiet of a studio at night, through 4 hours of drawing and discarding and drawing again. Owen had not been in the building. Owen had been at a networking dinner. I had called him the next morning to describe what I had found, and he had said, enthusiastically and genuinely, "James, that's it. That's the whole building right there." That response was real. His enthusiasm was real. His recognition that the idea was right was real. But he had not had the idea. I went to Sarah that night and I told her what I had heard, and Sarah, who is the most perceptive person I have ever known and who had been watching Owen for 4 years with the specific attention of someone who loves her husband and has made it her business to understand the people around him, looked at me with an expression that was not surprise. "James," she said carefully, "I've been noticing the way he talks about the company when you're not in the room. It's different. I don't think you should ignore it." I told her she was misreading it. I told her that Owen and I had 15 years of history, and that she was seeing something that wasn't there. I told her that partners talked about shared work in shared terms, and that was not the same as misrepresentation. She looked at me for a moment with the patience of a woman who has decided that some things have to be learned rather than taught. "Okay," she said, and she let it go. I have thought about that conversation many times since, about how clearly she saw something I was not ready to see, and how I responded to her clarity by insisting on my own blindness, because my blindness was more comfortable than what her clarity required me to consider. She had told me. I had not listened. That is a true thing, and I own it, and I will come back to it. But first, the email. It arrived on a Tuesday in March. I was at my desk in the Yaletown office at 7:15 in the morning, which was when I was usually at my desk, because the early morning was when I did the work that required uninterrupted thought. The design problems, the structural puzzles, the things that needed the specific quality of quiet that existed before the rest of the office arrived. I had a coffee. I had the project I was working on open on the left monitor. I had my email open on the right, as background, the way you keep a window open for ventilation. The email arrived at 7:23. The sender was Owen Mercer. The subject line was R.E. Northgate, Revised Term Sheet Summary. I did not immediately understand what I was looking at, because the email was not addressed to me. It had a recipient field that listed an address I did not recognize, and a CC field that listed two others I did not recognize. And for a moment I simply held it in the way you hold something that has arrived in the wrong place and needs to be redirected. Then I read the first line, and I stopped redirecting. Our internal email system, a setup that Owen and I had implemented 6 years ago when we moved to Yaletown, had a quirk that our IT person had flagged once and that we had never fully resolved. My email address was jcallahan@callahanmercer.ca. Owen's was omercer@callahanmercer.ca. The system had an autofill function that, when you typed the first few letters of a recipient, populated the field with a match from the address book. The address Owen had intended to use, an external contact at Northgate Capital, had apparently been close enough to my address in the autofill sequence that the system had offered me instead. And Owen, composing quickly and not checking, had sent it to the wrong place. He had sent me an email that was intended for the people he had been meeting with behind my back. I want to tell you what was in it. The email was a response to something from the Northgate side, a revised term sheet, as the subject indicated. Owen's response confirmed that the revised structure was acceptable. It confirmed that the timeline they had discussed, a letter of intent within 6 weeks, was workable. It confirmed, in the language of someone who had been having this conversation for some time and was now moving toward conclusion, that he was aligned with the proposed approach to the partnership restructuring that Northgate had suggested. The partnership restructuring. Those words. I read the email 3 times, slowly. The way you read something whose meaning you understand immediately, but whose implications require time to fully absorb. Then I put down my coffee. I sat at my desk in the early morning office, with the project open on the left monitor and this email open on the right. And I was very still for a moment, in the way of someone who has just received information that reorganizes everything they understood to be true about a significant portion of their life. I did not call Owen. I did not call Tom. I did not call Sarah. I did not do any of the things that would have been the immediate reactive response to what I had read. Instead, after perhaps 10 minutes of stillness, I forwarded the email to my personal account. I labeled it with the date and the subject. I filed it. Then I picked up my coffee and I looked at the project on the left monitor and I thought, with the specific, deliberate quality of a person who has just decided something, I need to know everything before I say anything. I want you to understand that decision, the decision to wait, to gather, to prepare rather than react, because it is the decision that everything that followed depended on. It was not a natural decision for me. I am not, by disposition, a strategic person in the way that word is sometimes used. I don't think about moves and counter-moves. I don't play the long game by nature. I am someone who tends to say what I think and trust the conversation that follows. 15 years of partnership with Owen had not changed that about me. But I thought about my father. My father, who had spent 35 years doing work that he did not document, did not photograph, did not record in any systematic way, because he believed the work spoke for itself, and the people who had experienced it would remember it, and that was sufficient. And when he retired, when the long roster of homes he had rewired and repaired and improved had become simply a part of the fabric of the city, there was no record of it. There were grateful homeowners scattered across East Vancouver who remembered him well, and there was nothing else. I had watched him make peace with that, and I had made a private decision somewhere in my early 20s that I would not make the same one. I would write things down, not to protect myself, not then, not with any particular threat in mind, just because writing things down was how I thought. It was how I organized the chaos of a working day into something I could understand and build on. I had done it since the week we opened the studio, in plain, spiral-bound notebooks that I bought in bulk from the Staples on Robson, one after another, 23 of them now in the filing cabinet in my home office. 15 years of the working life of Callahan Mercer Studio recorded in my handwriting, with dates. I thought about those notebooks in the 7:15 morning, with the email on the right monitor. I thought, I have been keeping the record. I just didn't know I was going to need it. I opened my email. I wrote to Priya Nair, our accountant, who had been with us for 8 years and who knew the numbers of the business the way I knew its spaces, completely from the inside, with the understanding of someone who had built that knowledge over time and maintained it with care. Priya, when you have a moment today, can we talk? I need to look at some things. Everything, ideally. Thank you. I sent it. Then I closed my email and turned fully to the project on the left monitor, and I worked, with full attention, for the next 4 hours. Because the work was still the work. It had always been the work. Whatever was coming, it would come, and I would handle it. But the design problem in front of me had a client who was counting on me, and that client deserved the same quality of attention they had always received, and giving it to them was both the right thing and, I found, the most stabilizing thing available to me that morning. I designed. 3 weeks later, I was ready. In those 3 weeks, I read the email many times. Not obsessively, not with the quality of someone picking at a wound, with the quality of someone reading a technical document for the information it contains, trying to understand not just what it said, but what it implied about what had happened before it, and what was being planned for after. An email is never just its words. It is also a position in a sequence, a moment in a timeline, and if you understand the timeline, you understand significantly more than the words alone. The email confirmed that Owen had met with Northgate Capital on at least 4 occasions over the preceding 6 weeks. The language of the response, the specific, comfortable shorthand of people who have been in a room together multiple times, told me that clearly. You don't write, as we discussed, 4 times in one email to people you have met once. It confirmed that the deal structure Owen had proposed to Northgate was not the 50-50 structure that our partnership agreement required. He had proposed 35% to himself, 15% to me, and 50% to Northgate. He had done this without telling me he was in conversations with Northgate. He had done this knowing that any acquisition of the company required both partners' consent. He had, in other words, been building a structure that he intended to present me with, not negotiate with me about, present to me, as something that was already in motion and therefore difficult to stop, at a moment of his choosing. This is a specific kind of strategy. I want to name it clearly because I think it is important to understand what it is and how it works. It is the strategy of the fait accompli, of creating enough momentum in a direction that the cost of reversing it feels higher than the cost of accepting it, of building walls before the other person knows a room is being divided. Owen had spent 6 weeks telling Northgate a story about the company and his role in it, and the story he had told them was the story he had been telling at dinner parties and industry events for years. The story in which he was the center and I was the excellent periphery. He had told it enough times that it had become for him True. Or true enough. True enough to build a deal on. I called Priya the afternoon after I sent the email. Priya Nair was 44 years old and had come to us through a referral from another studio whose accounts she had managed for 6 years before they dissolved. She was meticulous in the way that the best accountants are meticulous. Not as a personality trait, but as a professional philosophy, a belief that the numbers were the truth of a business, and that allowing them to be imprecise was a form of disrespect to the thing itself. She had a quality that I had always valued and never thought about strategically until that afternoon. She knew where everything was. Every invoice, every contract, every payment, every line item in 8 years of Callahan Mercer Studios' financial life was in her system, organized, retrievable. I told her on the phone as much as I needed her to know. Not everything, not yet. Just enough to explain why I needed what I was about to ask for. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in the even tone of someone who has already done a thing and is now being asked to confirm she has done it. James, how far back do you need? Everything, I said. 8 years. Another pause. I'll have it for you by Friday, she said. She called me back on Thursday. Can you come in? She said. There are some things I need to show you in person. I went on Friday morning. What Priya showed me in the next 2 hours changed the shape of what I was dealing with. Not fundamentally, not in a way that altered the central fact of the email and what it meant, but in a way that added a dimension I had not anticipated. Over the previous 3 years, a pattern of transactions had been running through the company's accounts that, taken individually, each appeared explainable. Small amounts, never more than $3,000 or $4,000 at a time, routed through the company's operating account in a way that blurred the line between personal and professional expenditure. A consulting fee that appeared on no engagement letter. A technology subscription that no one in the company used. A travel expense submitted for a conference that, when Priya cross-referenced the dates, had occurred on a weekend. I thought I was misreading it the first time, she said. She had her reading glasses on and her laptop open, and the specific quality of stillness that she had when she was being very careful with words. So I went back twice. The pattern is consistent. She looked at me. I should have said something sooner. I'm sorry. You're saying something now, I said. She nodded once. Then she opened a spreadsheet that she had prepared. Not something she had just made, something that had clearly taken time, with color coding and annotations, and the kind of organized precision that told me she had been carrying this for a while. This is everything, she said. I made it because I thought one day it might be relevant. I looked at the spreadsheet. I thought about the email. I thought about 15 years. Then I picked up my phone and I called my brother. He called the meeting on a Wednesday. Strategy session, he said in the calendar invite. Just us. Good news to discuss. The good news register. Owen had always had a gift for calibrating tone to purpose, for choosing the emotional key of a communication with the precision of someone who understood that how you said something was inseparable from what it did to the person receiving it. Good news. Come in curious. Come in open. Come in without your defenses up. I came in curious. I came in open. My defenses were entirely up. The meeting was in the small conference room, the one we used for internal conversations, not client meetings, with the whiteboard we'd had since the Main Street days, and the coffee table that had a ring stain on it from a celebratory bottle of wine we'd opened 5 years ago when we landed the Ridgemont Commission. The room held the sediment of 15 years of working together, the way rooms do when they have been the site of enough decisions and disagreements and breakthroughs to absorb some quality of all of them. Owen arrived 2 minutes late, which was unusual for him in meetings he cared about, and which I registered without commenting on. He had coffee. He sat across from me with the particular quality of ease that I had seen him deploy in client presentations. The ease of a person who has decided the outcome in advance and is performing the conversation rather than having it. He told me about Northgate. He told me as though it was new, as though the conversations had just happened, as though the term sheet was a recent development, as though the idea had come to him recently, and he was now, generously, bringing it to me because this was how partners operated. He used the word opportunity 4 times. He used the phrase exciting moment for the studio twice. He described Northgate Capital with the enthusiasm of someone who has spent 6 weeks building a relationship with them and genuinely admires what they represent, which was probably the most honest part of the whole performance. Then he got to the numbers. He said it the way you say something you have thought carefully about how to say, with the rhythm of a sentence that has been rehearsed enough that it sounds unrehearsed. The structure they're proposing, and I think it's fair, I think it reflects the reality of how the business actually operates, would give us 35 and 15, with Northgate taking 50. 35 and 15. I want to tell you what it felt like to hear those numbers said out loud by the person who was supposed to be my equal partner. It felt like the confirmation of something I had been hoping was a misreading. Like the moment when you have been telling yourself that the thing you saw cannot be what it appears to be, and then someone shows it to you in full light, and the explanation is no longer available. The email had told me this was coming. Knowing it was coming did not make hearing it feel like nothing. But I had 3 weeks of preparation behind me, and preparation is the thing that allows you to hold your face still when your chest is not. I looked at Owen. "How many times have you met with them?" I said. A pause. The first real pause of the meeting. The pause of someone whose prepared script has not included this question. "A few times," he said. "Just exploratory." "How many?" I said. He met my eyes. Something shifted in his. The performance quality dropped, just slightly, the way a mask slips when the face underneath moves unexpectedly. "4 meetings," he said. "But James, that's not—" "Over how long?" I said. He was quiet for a moment. 6 weeks, he said. I nodded. I said nothing else. I let the silence do what silence does when it arrives in a room where someone has just confirmed that they have been having a conversation for 6 weeks that should have begun with a phone call. Owen filled the silence the way he always filled silences, with words, with the momentum of language that had always been his primary instrument. He began explaining. The explanation was reasonable in its individual parts and dishonest in its architecture. The market conditions, the opportunity window, the fact that he had wanted to have something concrete before bringing it to me, the fact that 35 and 15 reflected a realistic assessment of their respective contributions to the business's success. That last sentence, that was the sentence. I looked at him across the table with the stain from the Ridgemont wine and the whiteboard with the ghost marks of 15 years of ideas drawn and erased and drawn again, and I let the sentence sit there between us for a moment. "I understand," I said. I stood up. I picked up my coffee. I walked out of the room. He followed me to my office. I had expected that. Owen did not leave conversations unfinished. It was one of the qualities that had made him excellent at what he did, the persistence that kept a client in a room past the point where they wanted to leave and brought them around to yes. I sat at my desk and he stood in the doorway with his coffee and the expression of someone who has pivoted from one approach to another and is now deciding what the second approach looks like. What he decided, apparently, was honesty. Not the honesty of someone who has reflected carefully and arrived at truth. The honesty of someone who has been running a performance and has abruptly decided that the performance is no longer useful and that what remains is what he actually thinks. "James," he said, "we need to be real about something." I waited. "The company is what it is because of the business I've brought in," he said. "The clients, the relationships, the profile, that's all been me. You design brilliantly, you know I believe that. But without someone selling it, without someone building the network and maintaining the relationships and being the face of this thing in the rooms where it needs a face." He stopped. He looked at me with an expression that was, I think, what he believed was honesty, but was actually the thing that comes just after a person has stopped managing you and started simply saying what they think of you. Be honest, James. Without me selling it, nobody would have ever seen your work. The room was quiet. I want to tell you what that sentence does when it is said by someone who has been your closest professional partner for 15 years. By someone who was at your wedding. By someone who knew your father and had sat at your kitchen table more times than you could count, and whom you had believed, for all of those 15 years, to be the person who understood your work more fully than almost anyone else. It is not simply hurtful, it is disorienting in a specific way. The disorientation of a map that has just been revealed to be of a different territory than you thought you were navigating. Because the sentence contained a version of something true, Owen had been essential to the business. The sales, the relationships, the profile, those were genuinely his. I had never disputed that, had never thought of it as anything other than the contribution he made in the partnership we had built together. But the sentence was not about what he had contributed. It was about what it would have meant without him. It was about the relative weight of each of us in the success of the thing, and it was delivered with the confidence of a verdict. I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about the Waverly House. I thought about 23 notebooks in a filing cabinet in my home office. I thought about Priya's spreadsheet, color-coded and annotated, prepared because she had thought it might one day be relevant. I thought about my brother Tom in Toronto, who had read the partnership agreement and the email and Priya's numbers, and had said, with the precise calm of a lawyer who has seen this situation in various forms many times, "He's chosen the wrong approach and the wrong lawyer." I thought about all of that, and I said nothing, because nothing was the right thing to say in that moment. I stood up. I picked up my jacket from the chair. I walked out of the office, past the desk where Priya was sitting, and who looked up at me with an expression of someone who had been listening through the thin walls of a Yale town office and had heard enough. Down the stairs, through the lobby, out onto the street where Vancouver was having one of its gray March days, the kind where the mountains are invisible and the rain is present without quite deciding to be rain, and the air has that clean, unresolved quality of a day that hasn't made up its mind yet. I stood on the sidewalk. I thought, that is the last time we will speak to each other the way we used to speak. Whatever comes next, that particular conversation, the one between people who are equal and know it, is finished. I was right about that. I walked to my car and I drove home, and I sat with Sarah at the kitchen table and I told her everything. And she listened with the expression of someone who has been waiting for the person they love to arrive at a place they have seen from a distance for a long time. She did not say, "I told you so." She made tea. The letter arrived 10 days later. It came to my home address, not the office, my home, which was a choice that communicated something deliberate about the territory being claimed. It was from the offices of Hale and Associates, and the letterhead had the weight of a firm that had invested in its own authority, the kind of thick cream paper and embossed text that is designed to make the recipient feel that the thing they are holding has already been decided by people who know more than they do. I read it at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning while Sarah was still asleep, in the gray light of a Vancouver spring that had not yet committed to being a Vancouver spring. Douglas Hale, the letter explained, represented Owen Mercer in the matter of the Callahan-Mercer studio partnership restructuring. He was writing to propose a revised partnership framework. He used that word, framework, as though what he was describing was a structure under construction, rather than one being demolished, that more accurately reflected the documented contributions of each party to the business's development and success. The revised framework was 60-40, Owen 60, James 40. I read that number twice. In the 6 weeks since I had first seen the email, Owen had gone from proposing 35 for himself in the Northgate deal to now proposing 60 in the revised partnership. He had moved 25 percentage points in his own direction. I noted this not with anger. I was past the phase where numbers made me angry, because anger is what happens before you have a plan, and I had a plan. but with the specific attention of someone watching a person reveal their strategy by the escalation of their demands. Attached to the letter was a document, 14 pages. It was, I understood as I read it, the work of someone who had spent time building a case. It outlined the history of Callahan Mercer Studio from inception to present, attributing the firm's significant achievements to Owen's leadership, his business development, his client relationships, his strategic vision. It described specific projects. It described specific clients. It described, in the careful language of a legal document that wants to sound like a factual account, the story of a firm whose success had been generated by one partner and implemented by the other. The document was wrong in ways that were not random. The wrongness had a direction. It consistently elevated Owen's contribution and consistently minimized mine in the precise categories: conceptual origination, design leadership, creative decision-making, that the partnership agreement identified as co-equal responsibilities. This was not an accident. This was a document that had been written with knowledge of the partnership agreement and had been constructed to address exactly its language while reversing its intent. I put the 14 pages on the kitchen table, and I looked at them for a moment. Then I called Priya. "Have you looked at the studio's project archive recently?" I said. "I look at it every month," she said. "Why?" "I need you to pull the design credit documentation for every major project in the past 8 years. All of it. Client briefs, design narratives, presentation materials, everything that shows who originated what." A brief pause. "James, I also need to tell you something else. Something I found after you came in last week." "Tell me," I said. What she told me added another layer to what I was already holding, a layer I had not expected, that changed not the fundamental shape of the situation, but the specificity of what could be demonstrated about Owen's relationship to the business he claimed to have built. It was not a large thing in isolation. In the context of everything else, it was the kind of detail that turns a pattern into a proof. I thanked her. I called Tom. There is a specific kind of grief that comes from betrayal by someone you chose. It is different from the grief of loss, which arrives from outside and takes something from you that you did not consent to losing. Betrayal arrives from inside the relationship, from the person you elected, the person you extended yourself toward, the person you trusted with the weight of your work and your reputation and 15 years of your professional life. When that person turns out to have been running a parallel account of what the relationship meant, the grief has a quality of retrospective revision that ordinary loss does not. You do not only lose what you had, you lose your certainty about what you had, which is sometimes worse. I want to tell you about the week between the letter and the call to Tom. Sarah and I had conversations in those evenings that were the kind of conversations you do not plan and cannot prepare for. The conversations that happen when someone you love is sitting across the kitchen table from you, and the room is quiet, and there is nothing useful left to say, and you say the true things instead. I told her things I had not said even to myself, that some part of me had always known there was an imbalance in how Owen talked about the work, and that I had chosen not to examine it because examination would have required a conversation I didn't want to have. That 15 years of choosing not to examine a thing does not make the thing go away. It makes you complicit in its continuation. She listened. She said, at one point, with the specific gentleness of someone who has been waiting to say something true, "You built something real. The fact that he doesn't understand what you contributed doesn't change what you contributed. You know what you made." I thought about my father again, about his 35 years of unremarked work in other people's houses, about the night I had decided I would write things down. I went to the filing cabinet in my home office. I pulled out the first notebook, November 2009, the first week of Callahan Mercer Studio. I opened it and I read. My handwriting at 32 was slightly different from my handwriting now, more compressed, the letters smaller, the hand of someone who wrote quickly because there was always more to write than there was time to write it. The entries were dense, meeting notes, design sketches in the margin, questions I was trying to answer, decisions made and the reasoning behind them. I read for an hour. Then I pulled the second notebook, then the third. By the time Sarah came to tell me it was past midnight, I had read through 6 years of notebooks, and I had understood something that I had not fully articulated even to myself in 3 weeks of preparation. The 14-page document that Douglas Hale had sent me was not only wrong in its conclusions, it was wrong in almost every specific claim it made about the origins of the firm's significant work. Not because Owen had contributed nothing, he had contributed genuinely, and the notebooks recorded that too. But because the creative origination of every project that had defined Callahan Mercer Studio, every project that had been written about, awarded, cited as evidence of the firm's particular quality, had begun with a sketch in one of these notebooks, in my handwriting, with a date. "An có nhiều hơn anh nghĩ đấy," Sarah had said 3 weeks ago. "You have more than you think." She had known what I would find when I started reading. I put the notebook down. I sat in my home office in the middle of the night with 23 notebooks on the desk in front of me and 15 years of a company's creative history in my own handwriting, and I thought about Douglas Hale's 14 pages, and I thought about Owen standing in the doorway of my office saying without me selling it, nobody would have seen your work. There is a thing that happens when evidence makes the full picture visible. It is not triumph. Triumph comes later, if it comes at all. What comes first is clarity. The specific, cold, settling quality of seeing a situation completely for the first time, without the softening of hope or the distortion of loyalty. I saw it. I closed the notebooks carefully, stacked them in order, and put them back in the cabinet. Then I went to bed. In the morning, I called Tom. "Let me tell you about my grandfather." Patrick Callahan came to Vancouver from County Clare in 1962 with $40, a second-hand set of woodworking tools, and a habit of writing things down that he had developed as a young man and never lost. He set up a small joinery shop in East Vancouver, custom furniture, cabinet work, the kind of precise handmade things that were already becoming economically marginal in 1962 and became more so with every passing decade. He kept the shop open for 31 years through the specific combination of quality, reputation, and stubbornness that keeps small craftsmen alive when the economics are against them. He kept a ledger. Not a financial ledger. He had one of those too, but that is not the ledger I mean. He kept a working ledger, a record of every commission, every design decision, every material choice, every problem encountered, and the solution found for it. It was not a journal in the personal sense. He was not a man who examined his feelings in writing, or if he was, he kept that record elsewhere and separately. This was the record of the work. Who had asked for what he had understood them to need, what he had made, and why he had made it the way he had made it. When he died, there were 41 of these ledgers in the back room of the shop. My father had brought them home and kept them in boxes that lived in the basement of the Nanaimo Street house for years. And when I was perhaps 12 or 13 and going through a phase of wanting to understand where I had come from, I had spent a summer Saturday afternoon reading through them. I remember the quality of the handwriting, deliberate, slightly formal, the writing of someone who understood that what they were putting down was a record rather than a note to self. I had not thought of those ledgers as a model, not consciously. But when I started Callahan Mercer Studio at 32, I started keeping a notebook. Not for any strategic reason. Not because I was worried about Owen or about anyone. Because building a company is the most cognitively complex thing I had ever attempted, and writing things down was how I processed complexity. How I moved information from the chaotic interior of a working day into something I could understand and build on. The notebooks were a thinking tool. They were also, incidentally and without intent, the most complete record of the studio's creative history that existed anywhere. 23 notebooks, 15 years, every significant project, every major decision, every design concept that had originated in a meeting or a late-night session or a conversation with a client that had turned into something I needed to capture before it dissolved. When I sat down with those notebooks and Douglas Hale's 14-page document side by side, the experience was not what I expected. I had expected to find confirmation of what I already knew, that my contributions had been misrepresented, that the document was wrong about the origins of the work. What I found was something more specific and more complete than I had anticipated. Because the notebooks did not simply record that I had contributed to the studio's major projects. They recorded the exact moment of origination for almost every one of them. The specific conversation or solitary session in which the central idea had arrived, the first sketch, the date, the reasoning. They recorded what Owen had contributed, genuinely, accurately, without the revisionist tendency that Hale's document had applied in the other direction. And they recorded, in the accumulation of 15 years of entries, a portrait of how the work had actually moved from idea to building. Let me tell you about the Heron Bay House. This was the project that had put us on the map, the commission that had been written about in 3 publications, and that, more than anything else, had been responsible for the quality of our subsequent client list. It was a house on the Sunshine Coast, a family home for a tech founder who had wanted something that was simultaneously private and connected to the landscape, that pulled the outside in without compromising the inside's coherence. It was a genuinely difficult brief, the kind that requires the sort of creative resolution that cannot be engineered, only found. Hale's document attributed the Heron Bay House to Owen's client relationship and his guiding creative vision for the project. In my notebook from that year, the entry for the week the brief arrived is one of the longest entries in all 23 volumes. 7 pages. Because the problem was hard, and I had been working through it for several days before I found the resolution. There are sketches in the margin, the early ones wrong, discarded, the later ones moving toward the thing that became the house. There is a date on the entry that precedes the first design presentation by 3 weeks. There is a note that says, "O in Toronto for the Ridgefield pitch this week. Called to describe the approach, he was enthusiastic. We'll develop further and present when he's back." Owen was in Toronto when I found the Heron Bay solution. He was enthusiastic about it when I called to describe it, which was genuine and which mattered. His enthusiasm was part of the process, his belief in the work, his ability to translate it for the client, his willingness to stand behind it in the room. I am not trying to say he contributed nothing. I am saying that Hale's document attributed the creative origin of the project to Owen's vision, and my notebook, dated 3 weeks before Owen had seen a single drawing, told a different story. This was not unique to the Heron Bay House. Of the 11 major projects that Hale's document cited as evidence of Owen's creative leadership, 9 of them had notebook entries predating Owen's involvement in the creative development. The entries were dated. The sketches were dated. The reasoning was mine, in my handwriting, with dates that could not be retroactively altered. I sat with the notebooks and the document for a long time. Then I called Tom and I told him what I had found. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the precision of a lawyer who has just understood the shape of a situation, "James, do you know what you have?" "I think so," I said. "You have the primary record," he said. "Hale has built a 14-page argument. You have 23 notebooks of contemporaneous documentation. In any proceeding, contemporaneous documentation defeats subsequent narrative. Every time." I looked at the notebooks stacked on my desk. "I know," I said. "You've been keeping these for 15 years, he said. "Yes," I said. A pause. "Why?" he asked. Not skeptically, genuinely curious, the way Tom was curious about things that interested him. I thought about Patrick Callahan's ledgers in the basement of the Nanaimo Street house. About a 12-year-old boy reading through 41 volumes of a grandfather he had never known well enough, finding him in the record of his work. "Because the work deserves to be remembered accurately," I said. "That's all." Tom was quiet for another moment. "Okay," he said. "Send me everything." What Priya had found after my first visit was this. In the 3 years preceding the Northgate conversations, Owen had been running a pattern of billing through the company that was not fraudulent in the dramatic sense, not embezzlement, not the kind of thing that produces criminal charges in most circumstances. But that was, legally and ethically, a clear misuse of company resources for personal benefit. It involved a set of personal consulting engagements that Owen had taken on in his individual capacity, speaking at conferences, advising startups informally, the kind of peripheral professional activity that many people in his position engaged in, and had been running the associated expenses through the company's accounts. The amounts were not large relative to the company's revenue. In aggregate, over 3 years, they came to approximately $42,000. $42,000 is not a number that destroys a partnership in itself. It is, however, a number that means something specific in a legal context. It is documented evidence of a pattern of financial conduct that a court or arbitrator would consider directly relevant to any claim about the good faith of the party who had engaged in it. It meant that Owen's legal challenge to the partnership structure, his claim that 60-40 was a fair reflection of relative contribution, was being made by a person who had, for 3 years, been taking from the partnership in a way that was not disclosed and was not authorized. Tom read Priya's spreadsheet on a Thursday evening. He called me on Friday morning. "The accounting material is significant," he said. "Not because the amounts are catastrophic, because they're documented and because the pattern is consistent. A pattern of undisclosed personal benefit at the company's expense, sustained over 3 years, speaks to the character of the partnership conduct." He paused. "Combined with the notebooks, we have something that goes beyond a dispute about who deserves credit. We have a documented record of one partner systematically misrepresenting his contributions and systematically benefiting at the expense of the partnership. That is a different conversation than Hale thinks he is having." "What does that mean practically?" I said. "It means that if Hale files anything, any motion, any formal proceeding, we respond with everything. The notebooks, the accounting, the Northgate email, all of it, organized and presented. And we make clear that we are prepared to make all of it part of the public record." He paused. "Hale does dissolution. He does it well. But what he does is move assets smoothly, avoid conflict, get people out with minimum friction. He does not do litigation. He does not do the kind of discovery process that would involve someone reading 23 notebooks on the stand while opposing counsel asks questions about every project in the history of the studio." I understood what he was saying. "He doesn't want to fight," I said. "He wants a settlement that looks like a negotiation. He wants you to accept 60-40 because accepting it is less painful than the alternative he's implying," Tom said. "He's never fully specified what the alternative is, because the alternative doesn't actually serve his client. His client wants the money from Northgate. He does not want a protracted dispute that delays the money, exposes the accounting, and becomes a story in the trade press about a studio's founding partner misrepresenting his contributions for 15 years. I sat with that. "Write the response," I said. "I've already started," Tom said. What Tom wrote to Douglas Hale was not a long letter. Tom's professional style ran to compression, to the specific economy of someone who understood that every word in a legal communication was a commitment, and that commitments should be made only when necessary and precisely when made. The letter was 1 page. It acknowledged receipt of Hale's correspondence. It noted that James Callahan had reviewed the proposed restructuring framework in consultation with his own legal counsel. It noted, with specific document references, that Mr. Callahan's records included contemporaneous documentation of the studio's creative development spanning the full 15-year history of the partnership, and that this documentation presented a materially different account of the contributions of each partner than that reflected in Hale's attached analysis. It noted, separately, the accounting discrepancies that Priya had documented, with the relevant figures and the period they covered. It noted that Mr. Callahan was prepared to make this documentation available in any formal proceeding that Hale's client chose to initiate. The final paragraph was 2 sentences. Mr. Callahan's position is that the existing partnership agreement, which provides for equal 50-50 ownership and dissolution terms, remains the operative and binding framework for any restructuring of or separation from the partnership. He is prepared to proceed on that basis at Mr. Mercer's convenience. Tom sent it by registered mail and email on a Tuesday afternoon. Then he called me. "Now we wait," he said. "How long?" I said. "Not long," he said. "Hale will call me by Friday." Hale called on Thursday. "I need to tell you about Northgate Capital. Because the story I have been telling, the notebooks, the accounting, Tom's letter, that is the story of what I had been building in response to what Owen was doing. But there was a parallel story happening at Northgate, and that story had a development that Owen did not know about, that I had known about for 3 weeks, and that made the entire situation considerably more complicated for him than he understood when he sent Douglas Hale's letter to my home address on thick cream paper. Here is what happened. Northgate Capital was a private equity firm, not a large one, mid-sized, focused on professional services and design businesses, based in Toronto with offices in Vancouver. They were serious people who did serious due diligence. When they began conversations with Owen about the acquisition, they did what any competent investor does before committing $8.4 million to a transaction. They looked at the legal structure of the thing they were buying. The legal structure of Callahan Mercer Studio was straightforward. The partnership agreement, signed in 2009 at a coffee shop on Main Street, reviewed by Tom Callahan, who was already a lawyer and had said it was clean. 50-50, equal ownership. Any transaction involving the transfer or sale of a significant interest in the partnership required the consent of both partners. Both partners. Northgate had known this from the beginning of their conversations with Owen. What they had been led to understand, what Owen had told them in the framing of the deal he had been building, was that the 50-50 structure was a formality, that James Callahan's role in the partnership was primarily technical and operational, and that James would be aligned with the transaction when it was presented to him. That alignment, Owen had apparently implied, was a matter of when, not whether. This is what I mean when I say that Owen had been telling a story about the company for long enough that it had become, for him, true. He had told Northgate the story he had been telling at dinner parties and in trade publications and in the doorway of my office. The story in which he was the business and I was the technical implementation. And he had told it with sufficient confidence that he had apparently believed, genuinely believed, that when the time came to present the deal to me, I would recognize the obvious reality of it and consent. What he had not anticipated was that Northgate would do their own due diligence on both partners. They found my name in every major project the studio had built. They found my name in the architectural press, in award submissions, in the design narratives that were the substance of the firm's reputation. They found that the story Owen had told them about the partnership did not match the public record of what the partnership had produced. And they did what serious investors do when they discover that the story they have been told does not match the available evidence. They asked questions. They called me directly on a Wednesday morning in April, 3 weeks before Owen held his strategy session meeting, and told me about Northgate as though it was news. The call was from a woman named Rachel Park, a senior partner at Northgate's Vancouver office, who introduced herself with the directness of someone who was not calling to be charming, but to obtain information. She explained that Northgate had been in conversations with Owen Mercer regarding a potential acquisition of Callahan Mercer Studio, and that in the course of their due diligence, they had identified some questions they wanted to discuss with me directly. I told her I was aware of the conversations. I did not tell her how I was aware. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the specific quality of someone recalibrating what they thought they knew, "Mr. Mercer indicated you had not been briefed." "He was incorrect," I said. What followed was a 40-minute conversation in which Rachel Park asked me careful, specific questions about the studio's ownership structure, the creative development of our major projects, my understanding of Owen's proposed terms, and my position on the potential transaction. I answered all of them honestly, directly, and with the specific documentation I had available. The partnership agreement, the project records, the notebooks I had been reading the night before. At the end of the conversation, she thanked me and said she would be in touch. 3 days later, she called again. "I want to be transparent with you," she said. "The picture that has emerged from our due diligence on both sides of this partnership is materially different from the picture we were initially given. Northgate requires that any transaction of this kind proceed with the full and informed consent of all parties. What we have been presented with does not reflect that condition." A pause. "We are withdrawing from the current conversations." I thanked her. "Mr. Callahan," she said before she hung up, "for what it's worth, the work your firm has done is genuinely excellent. If at some point you are interested in exploring a transaction on a basis that reflects the actual structure of your partnership, we would be open to that conversation." I told her I appreciated it. I hung up. I sat at my kitchen table on a Thursday morning, and I understood something that I had not fully assembled before that call. Owen had not only betrayed the partnership, he had attempted to do so through a transaction that required the cooperation of people who do not like being misled, and who, when they discovered the misleading, had withdrawn. The $8.4 million deal that Owen had been building for 6 weeks, the deal on the basis of which he had drafted the 35-15 structure, on the basis of which he had stood in the doorway of my office and told me nobody would have seen my work without him, was gone. Not because I had killed it, because Owen had built it on a version of the truth that had not survived contact with the people he needed to believe it. He did not know that yet. He held his strategy session 3 weeks later, presenting Northgate as a live opportunity, pitching the 35-15 as a fair deal, performing the conversation as though it was the beginning of something, rather than the end. I had known, from the morning of Rachel Park's second call, that Northgate was already gone. I sat across from Owen in that conference room, and I let him finish, and I asked him how many times he had met with them, and the answer was 4. And the meetings he was counting were meetings that had already, by the time he was describing them, led to a withdrawal he did not know about. I have thought about that moment many times since, about what it means when someone performs a deception for an audience who already has the information that makes the performance impossible. Owen had prepared that meeting carefully. He had calibrated the tone, the framing, the numbers, the moment of revelation. He had sat down across from me with the confidence of a man who controlled the information in the room. He did not control the information in the room. He never had. Hale called Tom on Thursday morning, 36 hours after the letter was delivered. Tom told me about the call that afternoon in the specific way he always reported professional conversations. Not dramatically, not with the pleasure of someone scoring a point, but with the factual economy of someone who wanted me to understand what had happened and what it meant. He was careful, Tom said. He didn't concede anything directly, but the call itself is the concession. If he believed his client had a strong position, he would have filed a motion. He called because filing a motion would initiate a discovery process that neither he nor his client wants. "What did he say?" I said. "He asked whether there was room for a negotiated resolution." Tom paused. I told him there was. The resolution was in the letter. 50-50 dissolution. 50-50 dissolution, per the original agreement, with a full accounting to address the discrepancies Priya documented. He paused. He said he would speak to his client. I thought about Owen sitting across from Douglas Hale, being told that the letter had arrived, being told what it contained, the notebooks, the accounting, the Northgate email. Tom's clear statement that James was prepared to put all of it on the record in any proceeding Owen chose to initiate. I thought about what that conversation looked like. I thought about whether it was satisfying. It was not, exactly. I want to be honest about that, because I think the idea of the moment when a person who has wronged you receives the information that their strategy has failed is supposed to feel like justice arriving, and what it actually feels like, or what it felt like for me, in my kitchen on a Thursday afternoon with Tom on the phone, was more like the closing of a chapter. Not triumph, not satisfaction in any clean sense. The specific quality of completion that belongs to something that has been finished rather than something that has been won. The distinction matters to me. I had not set out to defeat Owen. I had set out to protect what was mine, what was ours in the legal sense, what the partnership agreement had defined as equal from the beginning. Tom's letter had not attacked Owen. It had simply made visible the record that Owen had been counting on me not to have. He had made his move on the assumption that the room was dark. The notebooks were the lights. Tom called me the following Monday. "Hale came back," he said. "His client is prepared to proceed with dissolution on the original 50-50 terms, with the accounting reconciliation included." A pause. He also asked, separately, whether you would be open to a confidentiality provision regarding the accounting discrepancies. "No," I said. Tom said nothing for a moment. Then, "Okay, I'll tell him no." "Tom." "Yes." "Is it over?" He considered the question with the genuine care he brought to things that deserved it. "The legal part is over," he said. "Yes." I thanked him. I put the phone down on the kitchen table. Outside the window, Vancouver was having one of its spring evenings. The kind where the sun breaks through late in the day after hours of gray, and the mountains reappear to the north with the specific, sudden quality of things that were always there and have now chosen to be visible again. The light came through the kitchen window at the low angle of late afternoon and lay across the table where 23 notebooks had been stacked 3 weeks ago. The table was clear now. The notebooks were back in the filing cabinet. Sarah came in from the garden with her hands dirty from the beds she had been working in, the way she spent Saturday afternoons, and she looked at my face. "Well?" she said. "It's over," I said. She nodded. She washed her hands at the sink. She dried them. She came and sat across from me at the table. We sat for a while in the late afternoon light without talking, which was the right thing, which was the thing the moment called for. Not celebration, not relief exactly, but the quiet acknowledgement of two people who have been through something hard together and have come out the other side in the same place. That was enough. Dissolution is a strange word for what happens when a partnership ends. It implies a kind of disappearance, a dissolving into nothing, a substance losing its form. What actually happens is more structural than that, more concrete, more procedural. There are documents to sign and accounts to reconcile and assets to distribute and decisions to make about what continues and what doesn't. The personal dimension, the friendship, the shared history, the 15 years of choosing to stay in the difficult months, none of that appears in the dissolution agreement. The law has no language for it. The law only knows the company, and the company can be divided with reasonable precision. Tom and Hale negotiated the terms over 3 weeks in May. I was not present for most of it, which was by design. Tom had advised that the practical work of the negotiation was better conducted between the lawyers, and that my presence in those conversations would introduce an emotional register that would not serve the process. He was right. I spent those 3 weeks at the studio, doing the work, which was the most stabilizing thing available to me, and which, I had learned by then, was almost always the answer when I didn't know what else to do. The final terms were these. The partnership dissolved on June 1st, effective immediately. The split was 50-50, per the original agreement. Not the 60-40 Owen had demanded through Hale, not the 35-15 he had proposed to Northgate. Equal, the way it had always been supposed to be. Owen received his half of the assets, his half of the retained earnings, his half of everything that could be measured and divided. He received no preferential treatment, no recognition of the revised contribution assessment that Hale's 14-page document had outlined, no acknowledgement that the story he had been telling was anything other than what the documents said it was. The accounting reconciliation was included. $42,000, 3 years, documented by Priya with the precision she brought to everything. Owen did not contest it, which told me that on some level he had always known it was there and had been calculating the probability of discovery. The reconciliation was handled as a deduction from his share of the dissolution assets, quietly, without drama. Hale had asked again about a confidentiality provision. Tom had again said no. The figures became part of the dissolution record, which is a matter that exists in the world, documented and retrievable, which is the appropriate place for documented facts to live. The company itself, the studio, the clients, the work, the 28 people who had built careers in it, continued. This was the thing that mattered most to me, and the thing I had been most concerned about in the weeks of legal proceedings. A dissolution, handled badly, can take a company down with it. The uncertainty, the gossip, the exodus of people who see instability and choose to leave before it gets worse. I had watched this happen to other studios, had seen good organizations disintegrate because the conflict at the top had become visible enough to make the people in the middle feel that the ground was unreliable. It did not happen to us, for 2 reasons. The first reason was Priya. She had, without being asked, maintained the financial stability of the studio through the entire process, had managed the accounts, handled the client billing, kept the operational machinery running with the same meticulous attention she brought to everything, and had done so without allowing any of what she knew to become part of the general awareness of the office. She was the person who understood the most and said the least, and that combination had been essential. The second reason was the people themselves. 28 people who had come to Callahan Mercer Studio because of the quality of the work, who stayed because of the quality of the environment, who did not require the partnership to be visible and harmonious in order to do their jobs well. When the dissolution was announced, in a brief, honest, all-staff meeting that I held on the last Friday of May, in which I told them what had happened in the plainest terms I could find, and answered every question they had, the response was not panic. It was, mostly, the considered response of people who had been watching something for a while and were relieved to have it named. Several people told me afterward that they had noticed the change in the office over the preceding months. Not the details, they didn't know the details, but the quality of the air. The specific atmospheric shift that occurs in a workplace when something at the center of it is wrong, and that everyone registers without necessarily identifying. They had stayed. That meant something. On June 1st, the day the dissolution became effective, I changed the studio's name, Callahan Studio. 1 word removed, the work the same, the people the same, the address the same, the clients the same, the quality of the work, if anything, because the weight I had been carrying for months had lifted, and what remained was just the work. Better. I went in early that morning before anyone else arrived, and I sat at my desk and I looked at the studio that was now, in the only sense that had ever actually mattered, entirely mine. I had built it. I had built most of it. I had built the part of it that made it what it was, the design philosophy, the creative standards, the specific way we approached a brief that clients described when they explained to other people why they had chosen us. Owen had built the part that made it visible, that brought it into rooms where it needed to be seen, and that part was real and had been genuinely essential for a long time. But the thing itself, the thing that made it worth seeing, had always been this. I opened the project I was working on. I began. She told me on a Sunday in July. We were in the garden, our garden, the one she had been building for years with the same patient attention she brought to everything she cared about. And it was one of those Vancouver summer evenings that justify the winters, warm and long, the light doing something golden in the way it does late in the day, when the sun is low and everything it touches looks briefly like something in a painting. We had wine. We had the kind of quiet that exists between people who have been through something together and have come out the other side and are still, somehow, in the same place. She told me what she had seen. Not all at once. She is not a person who does things all at once. She is a person who builds toward things carefully, who understands that some information needs to be prepared for rather than delivered. But that evening, in the garden, in the long summer light, she told me the full version of what she had been watching for years. The dinner parties where Owen had described the studio to people who didn't know me, not as James and Owen's studio, but as his studio, the thing he had built, the design business he had founded and was running and was proud of. The industry events where she had heard him speak about projects that she had watched me work through in my home office at midnight, and had heard the ownership of those projects transferred so smoothly in the retelling that even she, who had been in the room while I worked, had felt the narrative pull of the version he was telling. She told me about a conversation she had overheard at a gallery opening 2 years ago. Owen, talking to a journalist who was writing something about Vancouver's design scene, describing the Heron Bay house. She had stood near enough to hear it, and she had listened as he described the creative vision of the project in terms that were, she searched for the right word, adjacent to what had actually happened. Not lying, exactly. Adjacent. Close enough to be defensible from a distance. False enough to be wrong. She had wanted to say something. To the journalist, to Owen, to me. She hadn't because the situation had been social and the moment had been wrong, and she had learned, by then, that saying things to me about Owen produced a specific response that was not openness. I should have been more persistent, she said. You were right the first time, I said. At the Kitsilano dinner party. You told me then. You told me I was misreading it. I know. I looked at my wine. I needed to believe it wasn't what it was. I wanted the partnership to be what I thought it was. You were threatening something I wasn't ready to lose. She was quiet for a moment. The thing is, she said, I think it was real. For a long time. I don't think Owen woke up one day and decided to take what was yours. I think it was more gradual than that. I think the story he was telling, the one where he was the center of it, started as a simplification and became a conviction. He told it enough times that he started to believe it. And once he believed it, he started acting on it. I thought about that. I had thought about it before, had arrived, in the months since the dissolution, at something similar. The question of when Owen had become the person who had sent those emails to Northgate, who had prepared that strategy session, who had stood in the doorway and said what he had said. I did not think he had always been that person. I thought he had become that person over time, through the accumulation of small choices, each one slightly more self-serving than the last, each one a little further from the truth of what had actually happened, until the distance from the truth was too large to close without admitting to everything that had taken him there. Does that make it better or worse? I said. Sarah considered it. Neither, she said. It makes it more human, which is a different thing. We sat with that for a while. The garden was doing what her gardens always did, being more fully itself with every passing season, the accumulated result of years of tending, of planting things, knowing they would take time to become what they were supposed to become. A climbing rose along the back fence that had taken 3 summers to reach its full expression. A Japanese maple in the corner that had been a sapling when we moved in and was now substantial, shading a quarter of the yard with the quiet authority of something that has simply been growing, reliably, while everything else was happening. I'm sorry I didn't listen, I said. She leaned her head against my shoulder in the easy way of someone who has been doing that for long enough that it is simply what she does, simply the shape of being near me. You listened eventually, she said. You just needed to find out for yourself. That was true. And it was, I thought, a thing worth carrying forward. The understanding that the people who love you sometimes see things you cannot see, and that when they tell you, the most important thing you can do is not explain to them why they are wrong. I had learned that. Late, but I had learned it. We stayed in the garden until the light was gone. I want to end with something true, rather than something tidy. The tidy version of this story is that Owen betrayed me. I discovered it. I had the notebooks, the accounting, the brother who was a lawyer, the partner at Northgate who called me directly, and justice was served, and the studio continued, and everything worked out. That version is accurate. It is also incomplete, in the way that all tidy versions of human stories are incomplete, because it omits the texture of what it actually felt like to live through it, and the texture is the part that has changed me. Here is what I know. I know that 15 years of genuine friendship and genuine partnership can be true and can also, in the end, be insufficient to survive the pressure of what a person wants badly enough. I do not think Owen and I had a false friendship. I think we had a real one that developed, over time, a fracture that we both failed to address. He, because acknowledging it would have required him to give up the story he had built his professional identity around, and I, because acknowledging it would have required me to look clearly at something I had chosen to look away from. We were both, in different ways, invested in the comfortable version. The comfortable version served us both until it served only him. I know that documentation is not paranoia. I have been asked, since the dissolution became known in the way that things become known in an industry where people talk, which is to say, quickly and imperfectly, and with details that shift in the retelling, whether I kept the notebooks as a precaution against Owen specifically. I did not. I kept them because my grandfather kept ledgers, and I had inherited the habit, and because the work deserved to be recorded accurately, and because writing was how I thought. The notebooks were not a weapon. They were the residue of attention, the physical evidence of someone paying full attention to the work they were doing over a long period of time. The fact that they became essential to protecting that work from being misrepresented was not something I planned. It was something that happened because I had been thorough, and thoroughness has a way of being useful in circumstances you could not have anticipated. I know that the people around you are your primary resource in the situations that test you most, and that this sounds obvious and is not obvious until you experience it. Tom, who drove it up from Toronto on a Friday morning when I called him, and who read 23 notebooks with the attention of a lawyer who understood that every entry was a data point. Priya, who had been keeping her own record because she was Priya and Priya kept records of everything, and who had been waiting for the moment when that record would be needed. Sarah, who had seen clearly for years and had held what she saw with the patience of someone who loves a person enough to trust their eventual capacity to understand the things they are not yet ready to understand. These people were not bystanders. They were the architecture of what I was able to do. And then there is Owen. I have been trying to find the true thing to say about Owen, and I think the true thing is this. He was a genuinely talented person who made a series of choices that moved him further from honesty with every iteration until honesty was no longer available to him without the cost of everything he had built on top of the dishonesty. That is a tragedy in the plain sense of the word. The story of someone undone, not by external forces, but by the internal logic of choices that compound. I do not wish him badly. I do not think about him often. But when I do, what I feel is something that took a long time to arrive at, and that I think is the only feeling that is actually useful in the long run. Understanding without excusing. The ability to see clearly how it happened, without needing it to be something other than what it was. He had said, in the doorway of my office, that without him selling it, nobody would have seen my work. I have thought about that sentence many times. Here is what I think is true about it. He was not entirely wrong. Without Owen, the work would have found its way to some people more slowly. Some clients would not have come. Some opportunities would not have materialized. Owen was genuinely good at what he did, and the studio benefited from it in ways that were real and that I was genuinely grateful for during the years they were happening. But here is what the sentence got wrong, and I think the wrongness is instructive. It assumed that visibility was the point, that the measure of work was the size of the audience for it, that the purpose of what I built at Callahan Mercer Studio, now Callahan Studio, was to be seen, and that being seen was Owen's contribution, and therefore Owen was the primary contributor. The purpose of the work was never to be seen. The purpose of the work was to be right, to solve the problem the site presented and the brief described and the client needed but hadn't found the words for yet. To make a house that fit a family the way a good coat fits a person, not impressively, not expensively, but correctly, which is harder and less visible than impressive or expensive and worth more. Owen had sold the work to audiences who appreciated it, and that had been valuable. But the thing the audiences appreciated, the thing that had made people lean forward in their chairs at the Potsdam conference and call Northgate Capital and write 3-paragraph emails to studios they had admired for years, that thing was not Owen's. It was the design. It was the solution. It was the specific, hard-won quality of the right answer to a difficult problem that can only be produced by someone who has been willing to sit with the problem long enough and carefully enough and has found the answer in the only place answers live, which is inside the work itself. Maybe fewer people would have seen it without Owen, but the people who saw it, the clients who came back, the colleagues who referred, the publications that wrote about it, the young architects who came to work at the studio because they wanted to learn how we did what we did. Those people had not come because of how Owen sold it. They had come because of what it was. And what it was had always been mine. I know this now without needing it to be confirmed by anyone. I walk into the studio every morning, the Yaletown office, the same building, the same address, the view of the street through the windows where we'd worked for 9 years, the whiteboard with the ghost marks of 15 years of ideas, and I sit at my desk, and the work is in front of me. And the people who are in the building with me are people who are there because they want to be part of the thing we are building. I open the notebook. I write the date. I begin.